In the misty heart of Red Hook, tucked between abandoned docks and forgotten alleyways, stands a restaurant sealed in time and in silence. Trattoria Vesuvio once hosted candlelit dinners and whispered Mafia deals. But when men began vanishing and neighbors smelled burning meat at midnight, the laughter stopped. The doors were bolted. No one ever saw who turned off the lights, until now. Isadora Quinn, 30, an independent journalist with a hunger for buried stories, inherits the Vesuvio building from a man whose name she's never heard, yet appears in the background of one of her childhood photos. The moment she steps inside, the rot returns. The kitchen hums. Ovens flicker to life every night at 2:07 a.m., and the scent of garlic gives way to something far more human. Old receipts list names of missing men. The meat grinder spins on its own, and Isadora starts dreaming of blood boiling in saucepans, and her own hands stirring. She thought she was uncovering a forgotten crime. But what if the kitchen is still open? And it's waiting for her. Something's still simmering in Brooklyn's darkest kitchen. If you're hungry for mystery, fear, and a taste of the uncanny, subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and keep listening. Because some recipes were never meant to be repeated, but someone's still cooking. Chapter 1. Inheritance. Brooklyn's Red Hook district hung beneath an ashen October sky, the afternoon light filtering grey and thin through a veil of harbour mist. Isadora Quinn pulled her wool coat tighter as she stood before the weathered facade of Trattoria Vesuvio, a forgotten relic among the neighborhood's industrial decay. The restaurant's once vibrant sign had faded to a ghostly crimson, the gold lettering barely visible against peeling paint. "You're absolutely certain?" she asked, not taking her eyes off the building as she addressed the stout lawyer beside her. Mr. Rossi nodded, his breath visible in the autumn chill. "The deed is ironclad, Miss Quinn. Mr. Salvatore Ricci left explicit instructions that upon his passing, this property would transfer to you. All taxes are paid through the year. The building is yours." Isadora's fingertips traced the envelope in her pocket, containing the single black and white photograph, a family picnic in Prospect Park, circa 1992. Her parents, herself at age 4, and in the background, partially obscured by shadows, a man watching them. The name Sal Ricci scrawled in her mother's handwriting on the back. "I never met him," she said softly. "Why would a stranger leave me a building?" The lawyer shrugged. "Wealthy old men make curious decisions on their deathbeds. The keys, Miss Quinn." He extended a tarnished ring holding 3 brass keys. "I've fulfilled my obligation. Good day." As Rossi's footsteps faded down the cracked sidewalk, Isadora approached the boarded entrance. The largest key slid into the padlock with surprising ease. The chain uncoiled like a dead snake, clattering against the doorframe. She hesitated, feeling an inexplicable heaviness in her chest. Just another story, she reminded herself. Just another lead. As an independent journalist specializing in historical crime, Isadora had developed a reputation for unearthing forgotten stories from New York's underworld. This mysterious inheritance could be her biggest breakthrough yet, or an elaborate waste of time. The door groaned open, releasing the stale breath of 30 years of abandonment. Dust motes danced in the shaft of light from the entrance, swirling around her like curious spirits as she stepped inside. The dining room materialized gradually as her eyes adjusted to the gloom, red leather booths still set with silverware, wine glasses upturned on tables, chairs slightly askew as though their occupants had departed in a hurry. A grandfather clock stood frozen at 2:07, its pendulum still. "Hello?" Isadora called, her voice absorbed by the dense silence. Only the distant drip of a leaking pipe somewhere in the building responded. She moved deeper into the restaurant, running her fingers along the mahogany bar. Despite decades of neglect, there was remarkably little dust. The bottles behind the bar, premium scotches, imported vermouths, remained unclaimed, their contents evaporated to sticky residue. A framed newspaper clipping hung behind the bar, yellowed with age. The headline read, "Local Restaurateur Wins Culinary Award." Below, a smiling man in his 30s stood proudly in a pristine white chef's coat. Salvatore Ricci's Trattoria Vesuvio becomes Brooklyn hotspot for authentic Neapolitan cuisine. The date, March 15, 1954. Isadora pulled out her phone and snapped a photograph of the article. "Who were you, Mr. Ricci?" she whispered. "And why did you leave this place to me?" Her footsteps led her toward the swinging doors of the kitchen. She pushed through, wincing at the loud creak of unused hinges. The kitchen stood in suspended animation, large copper pots hanging above an industrial stove, knives arranged meticulously on a magnetic strip, spice jars labeled in elegant Italian script. Despite the years of abandonment, the stainless steel surfaces gleamed as if they had been recently polished. The air felt different here, heavier, charged with something she couldn't identify. And beneath the expected mustiness was another scent, faint but unmistakable: garlic, basil, and something rich and metallic. At the center of the kitchen stood a massive butcher's block, its wooden surface stained deep burgundy despite obvious attempts to scrub it clean. Beside it, an industrial-sized meat grinder loomed, its metal components showing no signs of rust. A leather-bound ledger sat on a small desk in the corner. Isadora opened it, revealing page after page of elegant handwriting, lists of names, dates, and amounts paid. Some names had been crossed out, not with a simple line, but with forceful strokes that had nearly torn through the paper. The final entry, dated September 29, 1954, read simply: "La cucina è chiusa, per sempre." The kitchen is closed, forever. As she closed the book, a sudden draft caused the pilot light on the ancient stove to flicker briefly to life, casting momentary warmth on her face before dying again. Her heart jumped into her throat. Just the wind, she told herself, though all the windows were boarded shut. Isadora retreated to the dining room, settling into one of the booths. She pulled out her notebook and began jotting down initial observations and questions. The restaurant had obviously been successful. Why had it closed so suddenly? Who were the crossed-out names? What connection did Salvatore Ricci have to her family? The light outside was fading quickly, and Isadora realized she'd need to return tomorrow with proper equipment: flashlights, recording devices, perhaps a colleague for safety. As she stood to leave, her eye caught a small, leather-bound book wedged between the booth's cushions, a reservation book. She slipped it into her bag just as the building released a long, settling groan as if acknowledging her discovery. Outside, the street had grown quiet. Isadora locked the heavy door behind her, yet couldn't shake the peculiar sensation that she was leaving something unfinished, or that something inside wasn't quite ready for her to leave. As she walked toward the subway station, she failed to notice the kitchen window where, just for a moment, a small flame flickered to life, illuminating what might have been the silhouette of a man in a chef's coat, watching her departure. If this story has captivated your curiosity, consider subscribing to join me on this journey into Brooklyn's forgotten past. In our next chapter, we'll dive deeper into the mysteries of Trattoria Vesuvio and the secrets that have waited decades to be uncovered. Chapter 2. Echoes in the Dark Morning. Light struggled to penetrate the grime-covered windows of Isadora's apartment as she spread her research across her desk. Coffee steam curled around her fingers while she carefully photographed each page of the reservation book. She'd found the final entries from September 1954 showed a thriving business, every table booked for weeks ahead, with notations for special meetings in the private dining room. Several names appeared repeatedly, many that Isadora recognized from her research into Brooklyn's organized crime families: Gambino, Lucchese, Profaci. Her phone buzzed. Detective Michael Esposito, her reluctant contact at the NYPD's Historical Crime Division and occasional source. "Quinn," he greeted gruffly. "Got your message? You know I can't just pull missing persons reports from the 1950s on a whim." "Good morning to you too." "Mike," Isadora replied, tucking the phone between her ear and shoulder as she continued examining the book. "And yes, you can. You did it for the Chelsea Hotel story last year." A heavy sigh traveled through the line. "That was different. We had an active cold case. What if I told you I might have stumbled onto dozens of cold cases, all connected to one location?" A pause. "I'm listening." Isadora described the restaurant, the ledger of crossed-out names, and her unexpected inheritance. Something happened there in 1954. Something big enough to shut down a successful establishment overnight. I need to know if there was a spike in disappearances from Red Hook around that time. "You're fishing," Esposito said, but she could hear the curiosity in his voice. They'd collaborated enough times for him to trust her. Instincts. "I'll buy you dinner at Rouse," she offered. "You can't even get a reservation at Rouse." "I know people who know people." Another sigh. "Give me a week. And Quinn, be careful with this one. Those old mob properties, sometimes they're better left undisturbed." "Since when did you become superstitious, detective?" "Since I worked a case in Bensonhurst, where we found a family in cement under the floor of a pizzeria. Not everything needs to be dug up." After ending the call, Isadora turned to her laptop, searching archives for any mention of Trattoria Vesuvio. Several Society column items appeared. Celebrities dining there, positive reviews. A photo of Frank Sinatra shaking hands with a beaming Salvatore Ricci. But after September 1954, nothing. The restaurant had vanished from public record as completely as if it had been swallowed by the earth. She returned to the photograph of herself as a child, with the mysterious man in the background. Enlarging the image revealed little, just the partial profile of a man who would have been in his 30s then, watching their family picnic from a respectful distance. Her phone chimed with a text from Rosa, her photographer friend, "Ready when you are." Bringing the good equipment. By early afternoon, Isadora and Rosa stood again before Trattoria Vesuvio. The building looked different in daylight, less mysterious, more dilapidated. Steel-grey clouds threatened rain as they unlocked the door. "You weren't kidding," Rosa whispered as they entered the preserved dining room. "It's like a time capsule." Her camera clicked rhythmically as she documented the space. Isadora headed straight for the kitchen, drawn by an unexplainable pull. In daylight, filtered through gaps in the boarded windows, the space appeared more ordinary, just an abandoned commercial kitchen, nothing more, until she noticed the oven. "Rosa," she called quietly. "Was this oven door open when we came in?" Rosa joined her, camera lowered. "No idea why." The massive industrial oven stood with its heavy door slightly ajar, revealing a cavernous, immaculately clean interior. Isadora was certain it had been closed the day before. "Just making observations," she replied, unwilling to voice her unease. They spent hours documenting everything: the dining room layout, the bar's inventory, the curious ledger, the kitchen equipment. As Rosa photographed the meat grinder, she suddenly jerked back. "What is it?" Isadora asked. "Nothing. Just thought I saw—" Rosa shook her head. "Reflection, probably." By late afternoon, they had filled 2 memory cards with photographs and recorded detailed notes. As they prepared to leave, Isadora made one final sweep of the kitchen, opening cabinets and drawers. In the bottom of a drawer, beneath yellowed order tickets, she found it, a small leather-bound journal. The cover bore no name, but the first page was inscribed "Ricette di famiglia Ricci," non per il menù pubblico. Ricci family recipes, not for the public menu. Isadora slipped it into her bag just as the first heavy raindrops began to strike the roof. "We should go," Rosa said, glancing nervously at the darkening sky outside. "This place gives me the creeps." "It's just an old restaurant," Isadora replied, though she couldn't deny the oppressive atmosphere that had gradually intensified throughout the day. As they reached the dining room, a tremendous crash of thunder shook the building. The front door slammed shut, though neither of them was near it. "Wind," Rosa muttered, hurrying toward the exit. She pulled on the handle. It stuck. Isadora joined her, both of them tugging at the heavy wooden door. It remained firmly shut, as if sealed. "The back door," Isadora suggested. "Through the kitchen." They hurried back through the swinging doors and stopped abruptly. A pot on the stove was steaming. "Isa." Rosa's voice trembled. "Tell me you turned something on." Isadora slowly approached the stove. The large copper pot contained water that had nearly reached boiling point. The burner beneath it glowed a faint orange. "That's not possible," she whispered. "The gas should be shut off." Rosa backed toward the rear exit. "We're leaving. Now." The back door opened easily, too easily, revealing the rain-soaked alley behind the restaurant. They rushed out into the downpour, not stopping until they'd reached the relative safety of the main street. "I'm not going back in there," Rosa declared, water streaming down her face. "Whatever story you're chasing, it's not worth it." Isadora stared back at the building, where a thin wisp of steam or smoke now rose from the kitchen chimney. "I have to know, Rosa. I have to know why he left it to me." Later that night, alone in her apartment, Isadora began translating the recipe journal she'd found. The first several pages contained typical Italian dishes, traditional pasta sauces, braised meats, seafood preparations. Then the recipes changed. The handwriting became more hurried, the ingredients more cryptic. Pages were titled only with initials and dates. One recipe called for £150, cleaned and sectioned, without specifying what was being prepared. The final recipe, dated September 29, 1954, the same date as the ledger's last entry, was titled simply Pentimento, repentance. The ingredients list was blank. The method contained only one line. When the meat screams, "It is already too late." Isadora closed the book, a chill racing up her spine despite the warmth of her apartment. Her phone buzzed with a text from Esposito. Found something. Missing persons cases spiked in fall 1954. 5 men disappeared within 3 blocks of your restaurant, all known associates of the Gambino family. Call me tomorrow. As she set her phone down, the digital clock on her microwave flickered briefly before resetting itself to 2:07. Chapter 3. Secret simmering rain continued to pour over Brooklyn the next morning, transforming the streets into glistening rivers of reflected neon and washing decades of grime from the city's forgotten corners. Isadora stood beneath the limited protection of a faded awning, watching raindrops create ripples in the puddles at her feet, each concentric circle expanding outward like the implications of what she'd discovered at Trattoria Vesuvio. The coffee shop, where she'd arranged to meet Detective Esposito, sat 3 blocks from the precinct, close enough for convenience, far enough to avoid his colleagues' curious glances. Steam fogged the windows from inside, creating a warm haze against the cold, grey morning. She spotted him immediately as she entered, hunched in a corner booth, nursing a cup of black coffee, his weathered face a map of sleepless nights and seen-too-much eyes. His salt-and-pepper hair was damp from the rain, and he hadn't bothered to remove his trench coat, the shoulders still dark with moisture. "Thanks for coming," she said, sliding into the booth across from him. Esposito regarded her with a mixture of professional wariness and reluctant respect earned through previous collaborations. "Don't thank me yet," he muttered, his voice low and gravelly. "I'm not supposed to have these." He slid a manila folder across the table, carefully positioning it to avoid a coffee stain on the worn formica surface. "Make it quick." Inside were photocopies of 5 missing persons reports, all filed between August and September 1954. The men ranged in age from 27 to 61, all Italian-American, all last seen in Red Hook. Paperclipped to each report was a small photo, solemn faces in black and white, the kind taken for driver's licenses or passports. Isadora studied each face carefully. Unremarkable men with heavy brows and serious expressions, indistinguishable from thousands of other working-class Italian immigrants who had built lives in Brooklyn's crowded neighborhoods. Men whose disappearances might have caused brief ripples of concern before the city's relentless rhythm swallowed all evidence they had ever existed. Officially, these cases were investigated and closed, Esposito said, stirring his coffee absently. His spoon clinked against the ceramic in a steady rhythm, like a metronome counting beats in a fading song. Unofficially, he leaned forward, lowering his voice further. The detective in charge wrote in his personal notes, which I definitely did not access, that he was told to drop the investigation. Direct order from the captain, who got it from the commissioner, who probably got it from someone with an Italian surname and a lot of influence. Isadora felt a chill that had nothing to do with the rain outside. She reached into her messenger bag and pulled out her notebook, flipping to the photographs she'd taken of the reservation book. Her finger traced down columns of elegant handwriting. 3 of these men had reservations at Trattoria Vesuvio the nights they disappeared. Esposito's eyebrows rose. "You're sure?" She showed him the photographs of the relevant pages. Private dining room bookings. Victor Catalano, August 17th. Anthony Bonfiglio, September 3rd. Marco Ferrante, September 22. "Jesus," Esposito muttered, running a hand through his damp hair. "What exactly are you thinking happened there, Quinn?" A waitress approached, but Esposito waved her away with a practiced gesture that discouraged interruption. Outside, the rain intensified, drumming against the roof like impatient fingers. Isadora hesitated, unsure how much of her theory to share. The rational, journalistic part of her mind struggled to reconcile what she'd experienced with what she could credibly report. I think Salvatore Ricci was connected to organized crime, possibly as a money launderer or meeting facilitator. Something went wrong. People disappeared. People got whacked, you mean? Esposito leaned forward, his coffee forgotten. But that doesn't explain why he'd leave his property to a journalist he never met, decades later. Not just any journalist, Isadora said quietly, meeting his skeptical gaze. My specialty is historical crime. Mob stories. It's like... He was waiting for someone who would understand what to look for. The detective's expression darkened. Or he wanted someone to find something that's been hidden for a very long time. Something dangerous. Isadora thought about the boiling pot they'd discovered, the meat grinder that had turned on its own, the strange text message from an unknown number. Things she couldn't share without sounding delusional. I need to go back tonight. Not alone, Esposito stated firmly, his tone shifting from colleague to protector. Isadora smiled. Are you offering to be my backup detective? Professional interest only, he replied, though the corner of his mouth twitched upward briefly. Plus, I'm armed. He drained his coffee cup, grimacing at its bitterness. And Quinn, one more thing. I pulled Ricci's file. No criminal record, but there's a notation that he was questioned once in connection with a suspected arson at a rival restaurant. The investigating officer wrote that Ricci seemed genuinely disturbed by the fire. Said Ricci told him, "Fire purifies what water cannot cleanse." The words hung between them as another crash of thunder shook the cafe windows. Throughout the afternoon, Isadora pored over her notes and photographs in her apartment, trying to construct a coherent narrative from the fragments she'd gathered. Her living room wall had become an improvised caseboard. Pictures of the restaurant pinned beside newspaper clippings and timeline notes, red string connecting related elements. The recipe book sat open on her desk, its cryptic entries defying easy interpretation. What had seemed like innocuous cooking instructions now took on sinister undertones. A recipe calling for meat to be processed until no recognizable elements remain made her stomach turn. Her phone chimed with a text from Rosa, still having nightmares about that place. Please tell me you're not going back. Isadora didn't respond. Rosa wouldn't understand why she needed to continue, why the mystery of Trattoria Vesuvio had become personal in ways she couldn't fully articulate. The rain finally ceased as evening approached, leaving behind a misty haze that clung to the streets like reluctant ghosts. Dusk settled over Red Hook, like a heavy shroud as Isadora and Esposito approached the restaurant. The air remained damp and heavy with the scent of wet concrete and distant sea. You sure about this? Esposito asked, eyeing the building with professional suspicion. His hand rested instinctively near his concealed service weapon, and she noticed he'd worn a bulkier jacket than the weather required, likely concealing a bulletproof vest. No, Isadora admitted, her breath visible in the cooling evening air. But I'm going in anyway. The restaurant appeared different tonight, more alive somehow, as if awakening from a long hibernation. The boards over the windows seemed to have shifted slightly, allowing thin slits of interior darkness to seep outward. The brick facade glistened with residual rainwater, dark patches forming patterns that resembled watchful eyes. The key turned smoothly in the lock, and the door swung open without the resistance Rosa had encountered. Inside, the dining room was exactly as they had left it, except for a single table in the center, which had been meticulously set with fine china, crystal glasses, and polished silverware. A white linen tablecloth draped perfectly over its surface, without a single wrinkle. Tell me you did this, Esposito said, his voice unnaturally tight. Isadora shook her head, her throat suddenly dry. I haven't been back since yesterday. They moved cautiously through the space, flashlight beams cutting through the gloom. Water damage stained the ceiling in abstract patterns, and the hardwood floor creaked beneath their weight, each sound magnified in the oppressive silence. Esposito documented everything with his phone camera, while Isadora headed instinctively toward the kitchen, drawn by some inexplicable pull. The swinging doors parted silently this time, without the protesting creak from previous visits. The kitchen gleamed in the darkness, metal surfaces reflecting their flashlights in distorted patterns. The air felt warm, humid, active, as if they'd interrupted preparations for the evening service. "The stove," Isadora whispered, pointing. All 6 burners were cold and dark, but the large oven radiated heat. The temperature dial was set to 450 degrees, though no flames were visible through the small window in its door. "Gas leak," Esposito suggested, though his expression showed he didn't believe it. "In a building that's been abandoned for decades?" Isadora approached the oven cautiously. The pilot light wasn't even working yesterday. As she reached for the oven door, the overhead light suddenly blazed to life, momentarily blinding them. Esposito drew his weapon instinctively, blinking against the harsh fluorescence. "NYPD! Anyone here identify yourself?" he shouted, his voice echoing through the kitchen and beyond. Silence answered him, until the refrigerator hummed to life, followed by the dishwasher, then the overhead ventilation system. One by one, the kitchen appliances activated, creating a symphony of mechanical noise that had been dormant for 60 years. "We need to leave," Esposito urged, backing toward the door. "Something's wrong with the electrical system. Could be a fire hazard." But Isadora stood transfixed before the large meat grinder, which had begun to turn slowly, its mechanism creaking with age yet functioning perfectly. Beside it, a cleaver rocked gently on the cutting board, as if recently set down by invisible hands. "It's trying to show us something," she whispered. "It's an electrical malfunction," Esposito insisted, though his voice wavered. "Buildings this old, wiring goes haywire." Isadora approached the walk-in freezer at the back of the kitchen. Unlike the rest of the restaurant, this door was modern. A heavy stainless steel replacement, secured with a digital keypad lock that seemed grotesquely out of place among the vintage equipment. "This is new," she said, examining the keypad. "Someone's been here recently. Someone's been maintaining this place." Before Esposito could respond, the lights flickered and dimmed to a bloody red glow. The meat grinder accelerated, its mechanism screaming in metallic protest. Then, as suddenly as it began, everything stopped. The lights extinguished, the appliances fell silent, and they were plunged back into darkness, broken only by their flashlight beams. In the new silence, a soft ticking became audible. The grandfather clock in the dining room, dormant for decades, had begun to keep time again. Isadora's phone chimed with a notification. "A text from an unknown number. La verità è nella carne. The truth is in the meat." She showed the screen to Esposito, whose face paled in the flashlight's glow. "How is this happening?" Esposito's professional composure had cracked, revealing genuine fear beneath. "This is impossible." "Not impossible," Isadora replied, her journalistic instincts overriding her fear. "Just unexplained. There has to be a logical reason." They retreated to the dining room, where the grandfather clock's hands were slowly advancing toward 2:07. The meticulously set table now held a single object that hadn't been there before, a tarnished key, larger and older than those Isadora had been given. "Don't touch it," Esposito warned. But Isadora had already lifted the key, turning it over in her palm. It was heavy, made of solid brass, with intricate detailing around its bow. Engraved on its shaft were the initials SR and a sequence of numbers. 290954, September 29th, 1954, she murmured. The last day the restaurant was open. The clock struck 2:07 with a deep, resonant chime that seemed to vibrate through the building's very foundation. From the kitchen came a new sound, water beginning to boil. "That's enough," Esposito declared, taking Isadora's arm. "We're leaving. Now. Whatever's happening here, it's not safe." As they moved toward the exit, the front door slammed shut with a force that rattled the windows. Esposito rattled the handle, then threw his shoulder against the wood. It didn't budge. "Back door," Isadora suggested, fighting to keep her voice steady. They hurried through the kitchen, where every pot now contained boiling water, steam filling the air and obscuring their vision. The back door stood open, revealing not the alley but a brick wall where no wall should have been. "This isn't possible," Esposito whispered, genuine terror cracking through his professional veneer. Isadora clutched the key in her hand, its metal burning inexplicably hot against her skin. She looked around the kitchen, seeking anything that might accept this key. Her eyes fell on a small door near the pantry, previously unnoticed or perhaps not there before. A keyhole gleamed dully in its center. "There," she said, moving toward it despite Esposito's protests. The key slid perfectly into the lock. As she turned it, the boiling water in every pot simultaneously overflowed, cascading down the stoves and counters in steaming rivers that somehow avoided their feet. The door swung open to reveal a narrow staircase descending into darkness. "We are not going down there," Esposito stated firmly, drawing his weapon again, though his hands trembled visibly. But Isadora felt compelled forward, drawn by something stronger than curiosity or journalistic ambition. "I have to know," she said simply. The stairs creaked beneath their weight as they descended, flashlight beams barely penetrating the thick darkness. The air grew increasingly hot and dense, carrying that same scent Isadora had noticed on her first visit. Garlic, herbs, and something richly metallic. At the bottom, they found themselves in a second kitchen, smaller and more primitive than the one above. Stone walls wept with moisture, and a massive hearth dominated one wall, cold ashes piled within. Ancient-looking implements hung from iron hooks, cleavers, bone saws, rendering knives. Against the far wall stood a row of deep ceramic sinks. Beside them, a heavy wooden table bore deep stains and grooves from decades of use. "Butchery room," Esposito whispered, professional assessment briefly overcoming his fear. Isadora moved toward a small desk in the corner, where a leather ledger lay open, different from the one upstairs. This one contained not financial records, but detailed notes in flowing Italian script. As she leaned closer to examine it, her flashlight illuminated a photograph pinned to the wall above, her family's picnic in Prospect Park. The same image she possessed but unaltered, showing Salvatore Ricci's full face as he watched from a distance. "He was watching my family," she whispered. "Why?" Before Esposito could respond, the hearth erupted in flames, illuminating the room with flickering orange light. In that sudden illumination, they saw the wall behind the hearth, and the outlines visible within the stone human shapes. Dozens of them, pressed into the very foundation of the building. Isadora's phone chimed again. Another text from the unknown number. "Sono le mie vittime, ma anche I miei carcerieri." They are my victims, but also my jailers. As the message appeared on her screen, the temperature in the room plummeted. Their breath became visible in the suddenly frigid air. "We need to leave," Esposito said, his voice barely audible. "Now." This time Isadora didn't argue. They rushed back up the stairs, through the kitchen where the pots had stopped boiling and now stood empty, and into the dining room. The front door swung open as they approached, releasing them into the cool Brooklyn night. They didn't stop running until they'd reached Esposito's car parked a block away. Inside the vehicle, they sat in stunned silence for several minutes, the only sound their ragged breathing gradually returning to normal. "I've been a cop for 15 years, Esposito finally said. "I don't believe in ghosts. I don't believe in haunted buildings. But what we just saw was real," Isadora finished. "And it's connected to me somehow. To my family." She looked down at the key still clutched in her hand, its metal now cool against her skin. The numbers engraved on it, 2909 to 54, matched the final entry in both the restaurant ledger and the recipe book. "I need to find out what happened on that date," she said. "What made Ricci close the restaurant, and why he felt responsible for those men. And why he's reaching out to you from beyond the grave," Esposito added quietly. Isadora stared back at the restaurant as Esposito started the car. For just a moment, she thought she saw a figure in the upstairs window. A man in a chef's coat, his face obscured by shadow, his hand raised in what might have been a warning. Or a farewell. As they pulled away from the curb, the streetlights flickered momentarily, and Isadora's phone displayed the time 2:07 a.m., though her watch showed just past 9 in the evening. "What happens now?" Esposito asked as they drove through the misty Brooklyn streets. Isadora gazed out at the passing cityscape, where modern high-rises stood alongside century-old tenements, the past and present existing in uneasy cohabitation. "Now," she said, determination replacing fear in her voice, "we find out who Victor Catalano was, why he and the others disappeared, and what Salvatore Ricci did that haunts him even in death." The key felt suddenly heavier in her hand, a physical connection to mysteries decades in the making, and to answers that lay waiting in the abandoned kitchen where the pots never truly grew cold. Chapter 4. The final coarse dawn broke over Brooklyn, painting the industrial skyline in hues of amber and steel blue. Isadora hadn't slept. The events at Trattoria Vesuvio replayed in her mind. Each impossible moment dissected by her journalist's instinct for rational explanation. Her apartment floor was covered with research, photocopied police reports, newspaper clippings, photographs, and at the center, the leather recipe book with its cryptic final entry. She rubbed her eyes, stinging from exhaustion, and sipped coffee that had long gone cold. The wall before her had become an investigative map. Red string connecting photos to timeline events, creating a web of connections that both clarified and complicated her understanding. Her phone rang. Esposito. "I found something," he said without preamble, his voice rough from what sounded like his own sleepless night. "Birth records. Your mother's maiden name was Catalano, right?" Isadora's heart skipped. "Yes, how did you know that?" Victor Catalano, one of the men who disappeared in 1954, had a daughter named Maria. She would have been your mother's age. The revelation hit Isadora like a physical blow. She sank onto her couch, knees suddenly weak. "My grandfather disappeared when my mother was a child. She never talked about him. Said he abandoned the family. Or that's what she was told," Esposito suggested gently. "Kids in mob families were often protected from the truth. But that doesn't explain Ricci. Why would he watch our family? Why leave me the restaurant?" "I think," Esposito said slowly, "he might have been involved in your grandfather's disappearance. And maybe he regretted it." Isadora's mind raced through the implications. The recipe book. The final entry titled Pentimento, Repentance. And that text message, "They are my victims, but also my jailers." "Quinn," Esposito's voice turned grave, "I've requested the original case files for all 5 disappearances. There's something else you should know. The NYPD received an anonymous tip in 1954 about Trattoria Vesuvio. The caller claimed Ricci was disposing of bodies for the mob in his kitchen." "The meat grinder," Isadora whispered, nausea rising in her throat. She glanced at the photographs of the immaculate kitchen equipment, seeing them now through a lens of horror rather than historical curiosity. The case was investigated, but no evidence was found. The restaurant closed voluntarily the next day. Ricci disappeared for a while, then resurfaced in Florida in the 1960s. Lived quietly until his death 3 months ago. Isadora glanced at the recipe book, its innocent-seeming cover belying the horror potentially documented within. "I have to go back one more time. After what happened last night." "Are you insane?" Esposito's voice rose with genuine concern. "I need closure, Mike. My mother died never knowing what happened to her father. If there's even a chance I can uncover the truth, then I'm coming with you," Esposito said firmly. "And this time we bring backup discreetly." After hanging up, Isadora moved to her bedroom, where she kept a small box of her mother's belongings, items she'd held onto after her death 3 years ago. She hadn't examined them closely since the funeral, the grief still too raw. Now she rummaged through old photographs, costume jewelry, and handwritten recipes until her fingers touched something cold and metallic at the bottom. A child's bracelet, tarnished with age. She held it to the light, reading the delicate engraving. Maria Catalano, followed by a date, her mother's 5th birthday. The year was 1954, just months before Victor Catalano's disappearance. "He knew," she whispered to the empty room. "Somehow Salvatore Ricci knew who I was all along." Twilight gathered like bruises in the Brooklyn sky as Isadora and Esposito approached Trattoria Vesuvio. The evening air carried the tang of approaching rain and distant sea salt from the harbor. 2 plainclothes officers waited in an unmarked car down the block, close enough to respond quickly, distant enough to remain unnoticed. "You're absolutely sure about this?" Esposito asked, his hand resting instinctively near his concealed weapon. He wore a bulletproof vest beneath his jacket, protection against human threats, though Isadora doubted its efficacy against whatever awaited them inside. "I'm not sure about anything anymore," she admitted, clutching her bag containing the recipe book, her mother's photo, and the child's bracelet she'd discovered. "But I need answers." The restaurant loomed before them, its windows reflecting the deepening purple of the evening sky. Unlike their previous visits, the building seemed almost expectant, as if awaiting their return. This time the restaurant door was unlocked, swinging open at her touch with a welcoming creak. The interior remained unchanged from their previous visit. The set table, the grandfather clock now steadily ticking toward 2:07, its pendulum swinging in hypnotic rhythm. "We should call in your officers," Isadora suggested, suddenly hesitant now that they stood within the building's embrace. Esposito shook his head. "Let's see what we're dealing with first. They think we're just following up on a historical case. If I call them in for moving furniture and unexplained drafts, I'll never hear the end of it." They moved cautiously through the dining room, flashlight beams sweeping across familiar surfaces. The restaurant felt expectant, as if holding its breath. The chandelier overhead remained dark, but somehow the space wasn't as oppressively gloomy as before. Thin fingers of evening light penetrated through gaps in the boarded windows, casting elongated shadows across the checkered floor. Isadora headed directly for the kitchen, drawn by intuition stronger than fear. The swinging doors parted soundlessly beneath her touch. The kitchen was immaculate. Counters gleaming, copper pots hanging in perfect alignment, knives arranged precisely on their magnetic strip. The walk-in freezer with its modern lock stood like an anachronism amid the vintage equipment. "Someone's been maintaining this place," Esposito observed, running a finger along a stainless steel counter. No dust. "Au decay." Isadora approached the digital keypad on the freezer door, her heart pounding. "The code," she murmured. September 29th, 1954. She entered the date numerically, 29/09/54. The lock remained red, a soft negative tone indicating rejection. "Try American format," Esposito suggested, moving closer. "Month first," she tried again, 09/29/54. The lock turned green with a soft beep, and the heavy door released with a pneumatic hiss. Cold air billowed outward, like the breath of something long dormant, carrying the scent of metal and ice. Isadora and Esposito exchanged a glance before pulling the door fully open. Their flashlight beams cut through the darkness, revealing a space much larger than it should have been. An entire room, preserved in ice. Unlike the meticulously maintained kitchen, this space showed signs of violence: overturned furniture, shattered glasses, dark stains on the walls and floor that might have been wine or something far more sinister. A private dining room, frozen in the moment of some terrible event. "This is impossible," Esposito whispered, his professional composure cracking. "This room can't physically exist within the building's footprint." Isadora moved forward, her breath clouding before her in the frigid air. In the center of the room stood a large dining table, set for 6. 5 places showed signs of interrupted meals. Plates with half-eaten food now petrified by frost, toppled wine glasses, discarded napkins frozen in the positions where they'd fallen decades ago. The 6th place, at the head of the table, was untouched. The chair pushed back as if its occupant had stood abruptly. On the pristine white plate at this setting lay a single object, a gold pocket watch, its case engraved with the initials VC. "Victor Catalano," Isadora breathed, lifting the watch with trembling fingers. "My grandfather." The moment her skin touched the cold metal, the temperature in the room plummeted further. Ice crystals formed in the air around them, and their flashlight beams dimmed to feeble glows, barely penetrating the increasing darkness. The grandfather clock in the dining room began to chime, though Isadora's wristwatch showed only 7:43 p.m. 7 chimes. Then silence. "We should go," Esposito urged, his breath forming thick clouds in the freezing air. Something's happening. But Isadora remained transfixed by the watch in her palm, which had begun to warm despite the cold, ticking rhythmically after decades of stillness. The second hand moved with purpose, as if making up for lost time. Without warning, the lights in the freezer room blazed to life, not modern fixtures, but vintage chandeliers that couldn't possibly have been connected to the electrical system. The sudden illumination revealed details their flashlights had missed: elaborate wallpaper, ornate moldings, a sidebar laden with crystal decanters, and the table, now occupied by 5 men, their forms translucent, flickering like bad television reception. They ate and drank, laughed and argued in absolute silence, unaware of the observers in their midst. Middle-aged men in expensive suits, heavy rings on their fingers, confidence in their gestures, faces that matched the missing persons photographs Esposito had shown her. At the head of the table materialized another figure, Salvatore Ricci, younger than in the photographs, dressed in an immaculate chef's coat. He poured wine, served dishes, nodded at compliments. But his eyes betrayed him, watchful, wary, observing his guests with an expression of profound sorrow. "They can't see us," Isadora whispered, unable to look away from the supernatural tableau. "It's like a recording, an imprint of what happened." As they watched, the scene shifted. One of the ghostly diners, a heavy-set man with a thick mustache, rose to his feet, face contorted in anger. His silent mouth formed words that seemed to shock the others. Another man stood in response, gesturing violently. Ricci intervened, placing a calming hand on the first man's shoulder. The man struck him, sending the chef stumbling backward. Ricci fell, knocking into a serving cart. In the confusion, a gun appeared in someone's hand. Ricci lunged for it, was struck again, fell. The gun discharged in the struggle, then chaos, men fighting, falling, blood appearing on shirts and tablecloths. And through it all, Ricci crawling away, reaching the door, watching in horror as his guests destroyed one another in a silent symphony of violence. "My God," Esposito whispered, his face pale in the ghostly light. They killed each other. The vision faded, replaced by a new one. Ricci alone in the room, surrounded by 5 bodies, his chef's coat stained crimson, his face a mask of horror and resignation. He moved mechanically, checking each man for signs of life. Finding none, his lips moved in what might have been a prayer before he began the grim work of dragging each body through a hidden door in the paneling that hadn't been visible before the scene shifted. Again, the basement kitchen illuminated by firelight. Ricci working through the night. The images were mercifully indistinct, but the purpose was clear. The chef was disposing of evidence in the most efficient way he knew. The final vision showed Ricci sealing the hidden room, collapsing in tears before the hearth where shadows of his actions would remain embedded in the very walls. His lips moved in what might have been prayer or confession. The visions dissolved, leaving Isadora and Esposito alone in the freezer room, which now appeared as it truly was, a small, empty storage space with concrete walls and metal shelving. No trace remained of the elaborate dining room or its tragic occupants, except the pocket watch in Isadora's hand, still ticking steadily. "They killed each other," Isadora whispered, clutching the watch. "Ricci didn't murder them. He just cleaned up." Esposito leaned against the wall, his face ashen. "Self-preservation," he said grimly. "If the families found out their men died in his restaurant, he'd be next. So he made them disappear and closed the restaurant. But he couldn't escape what he'd done," Isadora continued, the pieces falling into place. The text message, "They are my victims, but also my jailers." He felt responsible. Imprisoned by his actions, they exited the freezer, finding the kitchen unchanged yet somehow lighter, as if a heavy presence had lifted. The recipe book in Isadora's bag felt warm against her side. "He was watching my family because he felt guilty about my grandfather," she realized. "He was making sure we were okay." The grandfather clock struck once, though it wasn't the hour. The sound reverberated through the building like a final heartbeat. In that moment, Isadora understood what she needed to do. She placed the recipe book on the butcher's block, alongside her grandfather's watch and the child's bracelet. "It's over now," she said quietly to the empty kitchen. "I know what happened. Your secret is safe, and your penance is complete." A gentle warmth spread through the room like sunshine breaking through clouds. The pilot light on the stove flickered one last time, then extinguished permanently. "What just happened?" Esposito asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I think," Isadora said slowly, "we just laid some ghosts to rest." As they moved toward the exit, Isadora paused in the dining room, her attention caught by something that hadn't been there before, a faded photograph on one of the tables. She picked it up, her mother as a young woman smiling, a man's arm around her shoulders. The man's face was turned away from the camera, but his hand bore a distinctive gold ring identical to one Victor Catalano had worn in the vision. "He was there," she whispered. "Ricci made sure my mother was taken care of after my grandfather disappeared. How is that possible?" Esposito asked, examining the photograph. "I don't know. But it explains why he left me the restaurant. He wanted me to find the truth, to understand that my grandfather didn't abandon his family. He was taken from them." As they left Trattoria Vesuvio, the front door closed behind them with a gentle click that sounded like a sigh of relief. The street outside seemed exceptionally vibrant. Colors more intense, sounds clearer, as if they were experiencing the world with heightened senses after their brush with the supernatural. The plainclothes officers approached, concern evident in their expressions. "Everything okay, detective?" Juan asked, eyeing the restaurant suspiciously. "Fine," Esposito replied, his professional mask sliding back into place. "Just following up on some historical research. Nothing to report." As the officers returned to their vehicle, Isadora stared back at the building. For just a moment she thought she saw a figure in the upstairs window, a man in a chef's coat raising his hand in farewell. "What now?" Esposito asked as they walked toward his car. Isadora clutched her grandfather's watch, its steady ticking a reminder of time's relentless forward motion. "Now I write the story, the real story. Not about mob disappearances or haunted restaurants, but about a man who made terrible choices and spent the rest of his life trying to atone for them. Will anyone believe it?" She smiled faintly. "I'll leave out the parts about ghostly visions and impossible rooms. The facts are enough. 5 men disappeared, a successful restaurant closed overnight, and the owner spent decades watching over the family of one of his victims, and the restaurant." Esposito glanced back at Trattoria Vesuvio, its darkened facade now seeming peaceful rather than ominous. "I don't know yet," Isadora admitted, "but I think it's time for this place to be more than a tomb for old secrets." As they drove away, Brooklyn's lights shimmered around them like stars fallen to earth. The pocket watch ticked in Isadora's hand, keeping time with the rhythm of her heart, a connection across generations that neither death nor silence had managed to sever. Behind them, Trattoria Vesuvio stood quiet and dark, its secrets revealed, its burden lifted, waiting patiently for whatever would come next. Chapter 5. Legacy. 3 months later, Isadora stood before Trattoria Vesuvio on a crisp autumn morning, identical to the day she had first unlocked its doors. But the building before her was transformed. Windows gleaming, facade restored, the sign repainted in vibrant crimson and gold. "You ready for this?" Rosa asked, camera slung over her shoulder. Isadora nodded, adjusting her blazer and checking her notes one final time. "As ready as I'll ever be." The documentary crew waited on the sidewalk, 3 young filmmakers who had approached her after reading her series on the lost diners of Brooklyn in the Atlantic. Her piece on Trattoria Vesuvio had gone viral, though she had carefully omitted certain aspects of her investigation. The official story, in 1954, a tragic accident at a private dinner led to the restaurant's sudden closure. The owner, traumatized by the event, preserved the space as a memorial before eventually moving to Florida. Decades later, he left the property to the granddaughter of one of the accident's victims, a gesture of reconciliation across generations. It was close enough to the truth. The director checked his watch. "We're rolling in 5, Ms. Quinn," Isadora nodded, her fingers unconsciously touching the pocket watch she now carried, restored and functioning perfectly, its gold case engraved with her grandfather's initials. She had found a single photograph of him in her mother's belongings, his smile recognizable in her own reflection. "This is more than just a story about a restaurant," she told the waiting camera. "It's about how the past reaches into the present, how secrets demand to be heard, and how redemption can come in unexpected forms." The interview proceeded smoothly, Isadora guiding the crew through the renovated dining room, where tables would soon welcome guests again. The kitchen had been completely modernized, no trace remaining of its darker purpose. The basement had been permanently sealed. Concrete poured over the staircase, entrance a decision the contractors had found odd but had been well compensated, to execute without questions. "What made you decide to reopen the restaurant rather than sell the property?" the interviewer asked as they concluded in the bright, airy dining room. Isadora smiled, looking around at the space that had changed her life. Some stories aren't finished being told. Some legacies deserve a second chance. What she didn't say was that she had felt compelled to resurrect this place, to transform it from a mausoleum of guilt into a celebration of the cuisine Salvatore Ricci had once been renowned for. His legitimate recipes, the ones from the first half of the book, would form the foundation of the menu. "And the name?" the interviewer prompted. "You're not keeping Trattoria Vesuvio?" "No," Isadora replied. "The new restaurant will be called Pentimento, an artistic term for when earlier paint layers show through a canvas, revealing the changes the artist made during creation. It seemed appropriate. Later, after the crew had departed, Isadora remained alone in the restaurant, completing final preparations for the soft opening scheduled for the following evening. Michael Esposito had agreed to attend, along with Rosa and a few close friends, witnesses to her transformation from observer to participant in her own story. As dusk fell, she lit a single candle on the bar, raising a glass of deep red wine in a silent toast. "To second chances," she murmured to the empty room, "and to laying old ghosts to rest." Something shifted in the air, not a chill this time, but a gentle warmth like a summer breeze. For just a moment, she thought she saw a reflection in the mirror behind the bar, a man in a chef's coat, nodding in approval, before fading into the gathering shadows. Isadora smiled and turned away, focusing instead on the future taking shape around her. Tomorrow these tables would host new stories, new connections, new beginnings. The cycle would continue, as it always had. Life emerging from endings, hope from despair, redemption from the darkest of human actions. Outside, Brooklyn continued its eternal rhythm, waves lapping against forgotten piers, trains rumbling over ancient tracks, millions of lives intersecting in moments of beauty and tragedy and everything in between. Somewhere in that tapestry, Salvatore Ricci had found peace at last. And so perhaps had she. As she locked the doors behind her, Isadora felt no ghostly resistance, no supernatural presence. Just the solid weight of old brass keys in her palm and the promise of tomorrow's light. If this story has resonated with you, consider subscribing to Journey with me through more tales where the past and present intertwine. Every life contains hidden chapters. Every building holds untold stories, and sometimes the most important truths are found in the spaces between what is said and what is left unspoken. Until our next exploration into the shadows of history and the light of understanding, remember that some stories, like the most powerful family recipes, are meant to be shared. The end.